On today's episode, the death of American justice. I'm Levi Bimba, and this is Do Laws. There has been a wide debate on the issue of justice, especially within American society. We hear about social justice and racial justice and all kinds of different justices that are out there in the ether. But one of the issues of justice is the main foundational really issue of justice, that people get what they deserve. They get what they deserve for breaking the law, for doing something wrong. And we are now seeing that trend to die out within this culture, and as part of, I believe, as the judgment of God on the nation, where people are no longer consumed with what is actually right and good. We're more concerned about what makes people feel good about themselves, and we don't want to offend people, especially within the one system that really its whole goal is to bring criminals to justice, bring people to justice, to bring them to a place where they get what they deserve. But we are seeing a downward trend, moving away from that kind of justice, which is what biblical justice is. You just get what you deserve for doing what is wrong. And obviously, the ultimate justice that was what we all deserve is that we ought to die in our sins and go to hell and pay for what we have done against God. But the good news of that is that Jesus absorbed that justice on the cross in his person, and dying on the cross for all who would ever believe in him, so that we could escape the justice of God and receive grace and mercy and righteousness and peace with God, the ultimate judge, who is a God of justice. But here on earth, while we are still waiting for the day of perfect justice to return to us as Jesus comes back, we are dealing with the death of justice within our own society today. In an article that came out in the Daily Wire by Benjamin Mann, who is a subject matter expert in risk management, compliance, security, and public safety. And he starts off by saying this: after at least 16 American cities broke homicide records in 2021, now as we enter the traditionally violent summer months, many of them are on track to surge past last year's bloody numbers. Cities across the nation are experiencing a 2 to 5 year upward trend of increasing violent crime, with little to no solutions offered by law enforcement, prosecutors, or state or locally elected leaders. This includes cities where unchecked violent crime was thought to have been fixed in the bygone era of the 1980s and 1990s. And I remember hearing about the 1990s, the crime bill that came out, and then Mayor Rudy Giuliani that came up in New York City and tried to clean up the city, and became a popular mayor because he kind of did a lot of proactive policing and kept people accountable back then. Not that everything went perfectly, but it was a safer city during that time. Benjamin Mann goes on to write, instead, leaders are dodging their responsibility for this rise in violence, from the COVID-19 pandemic, yes still, to the economy, to a consistent demand for gun control. Even in places who have been found to rarely enforce existing firearm laws, authorities are avoiding accountability, and avoiding accountability for themselves and for the criminals in their cities. They don't want to take responsibility. They're blaming COVID-19, they're blaming the economy, they're blaming all these other issues that are not dealing with the actual issue at hand, which is the rise in criminality within their society. And they don't want to hold the criminals themselves accountable, which is why it keeps increasing. In generations past, these types of chilling statistics would have been met with an immediate change in local law enforcement policies and criminal justice leadership. But now, however, in the post-Trump era of political polarization, mayors and the police executives, district attorneys, and the media establishment seem more concerned with controlling a narrative than making communities safer. But the fact is, the last 2 years were the deadliest in the histories of a myriad of cities throughout the United States. While homicides are becoming a daily staple of local news, what is notably absent from the coverage is any sense of accountability by the political leaders charged with keeping us safe. And I want to focus on that phrase just for a moment, where he says that the political leaders are charged with keeping us safe. And that's not just an American ideal. That's actually a biblical ideal. And we see that in Romans 13, verses 1 through 4, where Paul writes, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but from God. The powers that be are ordained by God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and those who resist shall receive for themselves damnation. So as people living in a civil society, the government that is ruling over us, we are to submit to them and honor them, because they are there because of God has ordained them to be there for the purpose, for his purpose in this time. So wherever you're living, you have a government that is over you. You need to be submissive to that government, or else you will receive damnation to yourself. That is the biblical ideal. And it goes on to say in that Romans 13 passage, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, an avenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So the sole purpose of government is for them to be a terror to evil, for them to take evil out of the society, to restrain evil as much as they physically can. And the government is given the sword, or in this case, the gun, to make sure that people don't engage in bad behavior. That's why every law enforcement officer, as far as I'm aware, they carry a gun. That's the authority that God has given them to carry that gun, to keep things in order. That's why law and order go together. Without law, you don't have a set standard of how people ought to behave. And without order, you have chaos in the society. And without people enforcing that law, then everything's just up for grabs. It might as well just become the purge. So Benjamin Mann goes on to write, violent crime is rising because we forgot the lessons we learned in the 1990s about controlling violent crime. He quotes Manhattan Institute adjunct fellow Thomas Hogan. And he says, for instance, research shows that 5% of offenders are responsible for over 50% of violent crime in any given city, which is really a crazy statistic when you think about it. It's only 5% of people that are responsible for half the crime that goes on within any given city within the United States. So really, it's really a testament to God's restraining power. If you look at Genesis 6:5, it says, then Yahweh saw that the evil of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And we see that we see that really within our own hearts. We have bad thoughts, bad words that go on. We have bad even impulses to do things that would be evil in the eyes of God, but we're restrained. And it's not because we're so good and so perfect, but it's because of God's restraining power on a society where you only have 5% of people that are really engaging in 50% of the crime. It's really a testament to God's restraining power within, especially our society. The Bible also says in Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? So again, we are evil by nature. Our hearts are not even are really brought through with evil intention, evil desires, things that we want to do within our flesh that we ought not to do. We have to be careful and remembering that it's not our goodness that keeps this society running. It's really the grace and the mercy of God. And again, and if it's the same 5% regarding the people that are doing the 50% of the crime, shouldn't we have the money and the resources, especially within American society, to really hone in on that 5% to restrain them from continuing to do the evil that they're doing? I think we can't say that we don't have the money or the resources to do it. We have the money in America to do it. We just don't want to do it. And you'll see that as we keep reading here. He goes on to write, over the last 10 years, a political sea change on the left brought about an ingenious plan to inject money into high-profile, low-cost local law enforcement elections. While this was sold to the public as a, quote, reshaping of a racist criminal justice system, it was actually a long-term political strategy that is now coming to fruition. And that is what the devil does. The devil will seek to encase his plans into something that sounds good. Of course, you want an equal justice system. You don't want people being treated differently based on what they look like at all, because that's evil. That's partiality. We talked about that before. That's being evil in your thoughts, looking at somebody and treating them differently or assuming bad qualities to them just because of how they look. That's an evil way to think in the world, and God hates that kind of thinking. That's partiality. And so if it's being done and by people who are in power, by people who are the judges, the police officers, the lawyers, all these people who are engaged in enforcing the law within a society, if they're doing this, then that's even more evil, because God has given them power to restrain evil in the society, and they themselves are engaging in that evil, and they will have to give an accounting for that at the last day of judgment. So he goes on to say, since the strategy of outsized funding for inexperienced local law enforcement candidates has taken effect, there has been a sharp rise in violent crime, mostly impacting the black and brown communities that these candidates claim to be running to help. This is largely because this political strategy pursues an unlawful backdoor to legislation that seeks to change laws by merely promoting the non-enforcement of them by the prosecutors these donors bought and paid for. So instead of putting prosecutors whose job it is to prosecute crime, to nail criminals to the wall, for lack of a better term, instead of using the laws on the books to enforce them, they're just ignoring the laws and just really lightening the sentences and lightening the punishments for these people who are caught. Which is why you have an increasing recidivism rate of criminals who just go into the jail and come back out and do the same thing again, and then go back into the jail, come back out, do the same thing again. That's just because of lack of accountability coming from the highest people who are paid with our tax dollars to really enforce these laws. He goes on to say, or he quotes Thayer from the National Desk saying, there's a direct correlation between spiking crime rates of several percentage points and the policies which they are enacting. So this is not by accident. This is a direct plan by people who are in power, the prosecutors, who are really ignoring the laws on the books or just tamping down the punishments of laws that are broken. He says this is evident by reviewing the murders and other heinous crimes committed by those left on the streets due to progressive bail policies or undercharging by the prosecutors funded by this movement. So instead of keeping people who are allegedly murderers in jail, where they just pay a certain amount of bail or even reduce the bail, where they can just pay the bail, get back on the street and go kill other people. This is happening all over the country, especially in largely populated cities like New York. He goes on to write, therefore, the vital link in the chain of the criminal justice system that prosecutes arrests made by the local law enforcement officers who risk their lives on our streets has been broken. Sadly, the result is violent crime rates soaring across the country. Not only are average citizens being victimized more than ever, but police officers are being targeted in greater numbers, not just by the violent criminals they encounter, but by the prosecutors who are supposed to be their partners in public safety. According to Michael Letts of Invest America, police officers are facing, on average, more than 60,000 assaults against law enforcement officers each year, resulting in 17,500 injuries and an average of one death every 55 hours or 158 per year, which is a crazy statistic to think about, that law enforcement officers are being attacked that readily, that much, when the Bible has told us repeatedly, especially in Romans 13, to submit to the powers that be, to not resist them because they are there by God's design. Does that mean that every police officer is perfect and that they're angels and that they're going to go straight to heaven when they die? No. Police officers also need to repent and put their trust in Christ. Police officers also sin, and they even sin on the job. And they will have to give an accounting if they get away with it here on earth. They'll never get away with it in heaven. But that does not give us the right to disobey them or to treat them wrongly or to talk badly about them, because they are God's ministers for good. They are the ministers of God. And really only two people in the Bible are called ministers of God. That's the prophets, the pastors, and the police officers. And they are there for God's design, both in the church realm and in the broader society. And they are there, both pastors and police officers are there to restrain the evil in society. Pastors are there to do it by preaching the gospel, by instilling biblical truth and values to their congregants, and so that parents can also in turn teach their children. But if that doesn't turn out, or if children are rebellious against that, then you have to have the police come in to restrain the evil physically within the society. He goes on to write, as a former law enforcement officer, I can attest to the bravery of those who volunteer to place themselves in harm's way every day. But once faced with the threat of unlawful indictment and termination from those you work with, the desire to serve is conditioned with the need to protect one's family and namesake. The result, a rapid decline in the necessary proactive policing strategies that were proven to end the last violent crime epidemic 30 years ago. And this makes natural sense. If you're a police officer and you are charged with keeping the law and keeping order in a society, but if you are doing things that are proactive, that are trying to restrain evil from happening in the society, but then your prosecutors are prosecuting you for being too proactive or doing things that are not right according to him, then you're going to more than likely refrain from doing those things and allow people to get away with certain things that they ought not to be allowed to get away with for the sake of keeping your own job. And because you have a family to feed, you want to be able to continue to provide for your wife and your children, or your husband and your children, and to do that, do your responsibility in the society without losing your job. So they just tamp down their vigilance, and they just allow things to go on that ought not to go on. He goes on to write, elected leaders who are sponsored by the woke movement are effectively protected by mainstream media that fails to cover the disturbing patterns of alleged corruption, fueling a breakdown in the criminal justice system. Consequently, the media have universally labeled the seemingly uncontrolled crime uptick as a gun violence epidemic. By using the term gun violence instead of the legal definitions of murder, attempted murder, and assault, the accountability for the criminals who committed these violent crimes is semantically shifted to the mere tool they illegally used to victimize others, which I think is exactly right. And which is part of the reason why we don't even like having accountability for ourselves. I mean, even growing up with both parents in the home, usually if you get in trouble with your mom, you don't really like it, but you're not really that worried about it because she's your mom. She's more tender, she's more loving, she's more caring, naturally speaking. I know some women are different than that, but generally speaking, most women who are mothers are more tender, more caring, more soft-hearted towards their children than the father. But if you got in trouble with your dad, that was a whole different story. Or especially if you got in trouble with your mom, you were begging her not to tell your dad before he comes in and really deals with you in a way that is fearful. And so it's the same thing in the broader societal realm. When you don't have the government, who technically really is the dad who's supposed to be more harsh and dealing with evil in the society, when they themselves are now tamping down the rhetoric, instead of saying that people are trying to kill people, they're trying to murder people, they're trying to rape people, we're telling, well, we're calling it gun violence, we're just calling it rape culture, all these kinds of semantic terms to change the responsibility of these individuals who are engaging in these types of behavior. Then you're going to have people who are more than likely will engage in this behavior because they know they won't be held that accountable for it. As you see it within the language being changed, instead of using murder, attempted murder, and assault, where they're saying the problem is gun violence, as if guns are just popping out of their holsters and shooting people and harming people on a daily basis without a trigger being pulled by a human being. So he finishes here this section by saying, further, by labeling this preventable surge in violent crime as gun violence, our media fails to hold our state and municipal leaders accountable for their outright refusal to enforce the law, which has led to these record murder rates. And this is exactly why swift accountability matters. And this is why in ancient Israel, God made clear that he wanted those who broke the law, certain laws, to be put to death pretty quickly. There was, after the gathering of evidence, after the gathering of 2 to 3 witnesses to make sure that what has happened really did happen. As soon as they found that out, there wasn't a prison sentence. There was no such thing as prison within ancient Israel. It was either you were fined, you were beaten, or you were killed on the spot for your crime. And we'll read a few passages from that. In Deuteronomy 17, verses 2 to 13, it says, if there is found in your midst, in any of your gates of the towns which Yahweh your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of Yahweh your God by trespassing against his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly host, which I have not commanded, and if it is told you, and you have heard of it, then you shall inquire thoroughly. Behold, if it is true, and the matter is confirmed that this abomination has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed to your gates, that is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone them, and they will die. On the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the mouth of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. And this is exactly the mindset that God wanted to instill within the society, where if somebody does something wrong, something that is evil, something that is worthy of death, you bring those 2 or 3 witnesses that say they saw it, and if they attest to the fact that they saw this person do something evil, then they themselves should be the first ones to pick up a stone to throw at the person that is guilty. And I think God put it that way, as far as the witnesses being the first to throw the stones, is that if they were lying, their conscience would be assaulted them at that point, because they would have to be the first ones to pick up the stone to actually kill the person that they are saying is worthy of death. So if they were lying about it, they may think twice about going forth with this lie, knowing that they would be the first ones to have to pick up the stones to put that person to death. But as far as the general point here is that God wanted to make sure that those who were worthy of death got their death sentence pretty quickly. The investigation was done immediately. The facts were investigated. The witnesses here in this case, were asked whether or not they saw what they saw, and if their stories agreed. Everybody went outside the city gates and stoned this person and dealt with it and went on with life. There was no prison sentence. There was no bail. There was no nothing. It was all about putting that person to death as quickly as possible, so the evil would be purged from the society. It goes on to write in the same chapter, if any case is too difficult for you to judge between one kind of homicide or another, between one kind of lawsuit or another, and between one kind of assault or another, being cases of dispute in your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which Yahweh your God chooses. So you shall come to the Levitical priest or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the judgment in the case. And you shall do according to the terms of that judgment which they declare to you from that place which Yahweh chooses. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they teach you. according to the terms of the law which they teach you, and according to the judgment which they will tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you, to the right or to the left. And the man who acts presumptuously by not listening to the priest who stands there to minister to Yahweh your God, or to the judge, that man shall die. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid and will not act presumptuously again. So if you had a hard case, you went to the priest, you went to the other judges that were there, and they dealt with the details more rigorously, more thoroughly in this case, and were able to kind of use their influence and their power in the society to get to the facts of the case. And whatever the judgment they came up with, that was to be followed. And now, if you didn't follow that judgment, even if it was a judgment that wasn't worthy of death, for example, if your ox gored somebody, you got to restore 2 or 3 or 4 oxes to the person's ox that was gored. And you said, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, that lighter sentence of restoring 3 or 4 oxen to your neighbor turned into a death sentence because you didn't do what the judges told you to do. So if you're not willing to go along with what the judges did, you inherited a death sentence upon yourself. And that was for good reason, because God, as God says here, all people will hear and be afraid and will not act presumptuously again. So it's to really tamp down against the arrogance, the nonchalant attitude that criminals would have if by not obeying the laws by not obeying the judgments given to them. Deuteronomy 19:15-21 says, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be established. Again, that's why it's so important to gather evidence, to gather 2 or 3 witnesses regarding these issues, because this is a serious issue, especially an issue of death. So you want to make sure that what is being told is not just one person making up a lie to get somebody in trouble, but you're having 2 or 3 people engaging in the same factual pattern. Then you have more of a case to build against the person who allegedly is guilty. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before Yahweh, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. And the judges shall inquire thoroughly, and behold, if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you, and the rest will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such an evil thing among you. Thus your eye shall not show pity, for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So on top of there not being allowed one witness to bring somebody to a guilty death sentence, if you had somebody who was accusing somebody of something and it turned out to be wrong, even with 2 or 3 other witnesses, then they would have to suffer the sentence that they wished to have done against the person that they were accusing. So, for example, if you wanted to have somebody die for you accused them of murdering somebody, and you even got 2 or 3 of your friends to agree with you in this lie, to accuse this person that they murdered somebody, and after the investigation that comes out, the judges realize that you lied about it. What you guys intended for this person to suffer, you yourself would suffer. So if they found out you lied, you then would go and suffer a death sentence for making up this lie against somebody who you wanted to be put to death. So that was kind of the God's way of tamping down slander within ancient Israel. And we see an example of this that took place regarding the Sabbath. And one of the Sabbath laws in Exodus 31:14-15, it says, therefore you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So in 2 verses, God repeated it twice. If you break the Sabbath, you deserve the death sentence. You deserve the death penalty in ancient Israel. And we see an example of what happened when somebody did break this law in Numbers 15:32-36. Now the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, and they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering wood brought him near to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. So they didn't have necessarily a prisoner. They just kept him in a certain area where he couldn't escape at that time until the judgment should come down on him. So it goes on to say, then Yahweh said to Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. So again, short period of time. So God made a law: you break the Sabbath, you deserve to be put to death. You have this man who was gathering wood on the Sabbath day, doing work that clearly violated the Sabbath. So they put him in ward. Moses came back from where he was, as if nobody knew exactly what should happen. I mean, just to make sure that God was, even though God repeated it twice in Exodus 31, 14, and 15, they went to God and said, okay, God, we found this man gathering sticks on the Sabbath, gathering wood. What should we do with him? And God said, well, just like I told you before, this person needs to be put to death. So they went and put him to death, stoning him with stones outside the camp. That's how you deal with evil. And as far as we know, there was never any other breaking of the Sabbath until later on, when they desired to have a king, and then Israel just went downhill from there. But besides the fact, nobody else ever broke the Sabbath after that, because it was dealt with immediately. It was dealt with swiftly. They were held accountable for their actions. They weren't giving a slap on the wrist. They weren't giving leniency. It even, because ancient Israel, or because of Israel's later actions, when they had kings, and had King Saul and King David and Solomon and so on and so forth. The reason why they were punished is because they didn't do justice within the society. They didn't do what was right in the eyes of God. They didn't hold people accountable for the sins that they were committing. Everybody was corrupt, from the king down to the lowest of the low, and then in ancient Israel. And that was part of the main reason why God caused them to be brought into slavery and brought into captivity and suffer pestilence and suffer starvation. All kinds of things that took place was because they didn't hold people accountable within their society. So we see America do the same thing, not holding people accountable for their sins, not holding people accountable for their law breaking. We are liable to suffer the same fate that ancient Israel suffered because of their sins against God. So if we want to have a society where peace and justice rules the day, we have to have a society that holds people accountable for their sins. And that starts with the prosecutors, the law enforcement officers, and those who are placed as authorities of God, as ministers of God, to enforce that which is good within the society. So thank you for listening today, and I'll see you on the next episode of Doulos.